In 1995, a household earning $55,000 stood a little more than 3 times its annual income away from a median-priced American home. In 2023, a household earning that same $55,000 in real terms, the same purchasing power, adjusted for inflation, stood roughly 7 to 8 times its income away from that same median home. The wage held. The distance nearly tripled. Notice what did not change in that comparison: not the effort, not the discipline, not the willingness to save a portion of every paycheck, to avoid frivolous debt, to buy things that last. The household in 2023 is, by almost every behavioral measure a financial advisor from 1995 would recognize, doing the right things. It is not spending recklessly, it is not gambling, it is following the playbook. And it is falling behind anyway. This is the puzzle this documentary is built around. Across the American middle class, there is a large and growing population of households that are financially responsible by every conventional standard and are, at the same time, quietly stuck. Not sliding into ruin, but not moving forward either. Running in place. And the more carefully they follow the rules they were handed, the more precisely they seem to stay in the same spot. The reflexive explanation is a moral one. Somebody wasn't disciplined enough. Somebody bought too much house or too much car or too many lattes. That story is comforting because it implies control. If the problem is a personal failing, the solution is personal effort. But the arithmetic doesn't cooperate. The households described here are frequently the most disciplined ones. The savers, the debt avoiders, the buy it once and keep it families. They are stuck not despite doing what they were told, but because of it. Here is the central claim, stated plainly. The habits keeping these households in place are not vices. They are the correct financial playbook of an economy that no longer exists. Each one was rational, genuinely, provably rational, under the structural conditions of roughly 1985 to 2005. A specific relationship between wages and asset prices, a specific credit environment, a specific composition of inflation. Somewhere in the last 2 decades, those conditions shifted. The habits did not shift with them. And a habit that made you money under one set of rules can quietly cost you money under another, while feeling exactly as responsible as it always did. There are 7 of them. The savings account treated as the default home for money in a world where real yields collapsed after 2009. The home bought as forced savings in a market where it has become a leveraged, concentrated bet. The loyalty to a single employer held against decades of wage stagnation. The debt aversion so complete it refuses productive leverage while quietly absorbing invisible cost inflation. The instinct to buy reliability, new cars, appliances as depreciation transfer. The retreat from equities carried out of scar tissue from the 2000s. And the treatment of taxes and benefits as paperwork rather than as one of the largest portfolio decisions a household ever makes. 7 ordinary, respectable, widely recommended habits. Suspects, all of them, in the case of the household that did everything right and went nowhere. What makes them so difficult to see is precisely their history. Every one of these habits was, at some point, the smart move, which is exactly what makes them dangerous now. To understand why the rules stopped working, it helps to see the years when they worked spectacularly well, and to notice how ordinary that success felt to the people living inside it. Start in 1985. A household buying a median home committed to something close to 3 times its annual income. Mortgage rates were high by later standards, but the price of the asset itself sat within reach of a single strong income. A factory wage or a teacher's salary could carry a house, and the house, once carried, did something quietly remarkable. It forced savings on people who might otherwise have saved nothing. Every mortgage payment retired a little principal. Every year, the asset tended to appreciate faster than the debt against it eroded. Discipline and structure did the work. The household barely had to think. Now widen the lens, because this pattern had a precedent, and the precedent is instructive. 2 generations earlier, American workers were handed a different certainty: the defined benefit pension. Stay with one employer, keep your head down, and the company would fund your retirement for you. For decades, this was not naive. It was the rational response to how large firms actually behaved. Loyalty was compensated in deferred, guaranteed income. A worker who job hopped was, under those conditions, leaving money on the table. Hold those two images together, the forced savings house and the loyalty rewarding pension, because they share a hidden architecture. Both quietly outsourced the hard part of building wealth to a stable external structure. The house appreciated on its own. The pension accrued on its own. All the household had to supply was patience and consistency, and the machinery around it converted that consistency into net worth. That was the deep logic of the 1985 to 2005 economy, and every habit this documentary examines grew directly out of it. The savings account made sense when it paid real interest above inflation. Buying a car new made sense when reliable used cars were scarcer, and the depreciation gap was narrower. Avoiding debt made sense when the costs debt was protecting you from were roughly stable year to year. Staying out of stocks felt defensible to anyone who remembered a crash, because the house was already doing the compounding. None of these were errors. Each was a locally optimal response to a real structure that genuinely rewarded it. Here is the turning point the pension parallel makes visible. Structures that quietly do the compounding for you do not announce their own expiration. The pension worker who stayed loyal through the 1990s was often the last one standing when the plan was frozen, converted, or terminated. No siren sounded the day the arithmetic reversed. The habit, loyalty, remained emotionally identical on both sides of that line. It simply stopped paying and kept feeling responsible while it stopped. That is the consequence that governs everything that follows. When the external structure changes underneath a habit, the habit does not feel different from the inside. It feels exactly as prudent as it always did. The saver still feels prudent. The homeowner still feels anchored. The loyal employee still feels stable. The signal that would tell them to adjust, the memo announcing the rules had changed, was never sent because there was no one whose job it was to send it. So the households in this story are not running an irrational playbook. They are running yesterday's rational playbook with admirable fidelity into an economy that quietly swapped out the board beneath it. Which raises the only question that matters next. If all 7 habits share this same flaw, they cannot all be costing the same amount. One of them is doing more damage than the other 6 combined, and it is rarely the one people suspect. Before we find the single worst habit, start with the one that looks most innocent. Because if even this one has turned against the saver, none of the 7 is safe. The obvious objection comes fast, and it deserves a fair hearing. What could possibly be wrong with keeping money in a savings account? It is the most responsible instinct a household has. It is the opposite of gambling. You cannot lose money in an FDIC-insured account, the reasoning goes. So it must be the safe place, the one habit no advisor, no parent, no cautious instinct would ever fault. Take that seriously, because for a long stretch it was not just safe, it was genuinely productive. Through much of the 1980s and 1990s, a passbook or money market account did something modern savers have never witnessed. It paid a real return simply for holding cash. In the early 1980s, savings vehicles routinely yielded double digits while inflation, though high, ran below them. Even in the calmer 1990s, a household could park money in a certificate of deposit and earn several percentage points above the rate at which prices were rising. The cash was not merely preserved, it grew in purchasing power while sitting still. Saving in dollars was, mechanically, a way to get richer by doing nothing, the lowest effort, lowest risk compounding available to an ordinary family. A household that kept $20,000 in the bank in 1990 could reasonably expect that pile to buy more the following year than it did that one. That is the steelman. It is not sentimental, it is arithmetic, and for 2 decades the arithmetic was on the saver's side. Now watch the mechanism reverse. The real return on cash is a subtraction problem with 2 terms, the interest you earn minus the rate at which prices rise. For that subtraction to leave you ahead, the first number has to beat the second. After the 2008 crisis, the Federal Reserve drove short-term rates to near zero and held them there, with brief interruptions, for the better part of a decade. Savings accounts followed. For years, the national average paid a fraction of 1%, often less than 0.1%. Inflation, even in its quiet years, ran closer to 2. Do the subtraction. Earn 0.1%, lose 2% to rising prices. and the money in that account is shrinking in real terms by nearly 2% every year. Not on a statement, the dollar figure holds steady or ticks up a few cents, but in what those dollars can actually buy. The account that made a 1990 household richer for standing still now makes a 2015 household quietly poorer for the exact same behavior. Same instinct, same discipline, opposite outcome. The cruelty of the mechanism is that it is invisible by design. A brokerage account that falls 15% shows you a red number and forces a reckoning. A savings account never shows red. The balance only goes up. The loss is laundered through the price of everything else, the groceries, the insurance, the rent, so the saver experiences the erosion as the world getting more expensive rather than as their savings decaying. There is no statement that reports it. There is no memo. The leak is real, and it is permitted, and it never announces itself. The correction is not to abandon liquidity. A household still needs cash. It can reach in an emergency, and that money belongs somewhere safe by definition. Its job is availability, not growth. The adjustment is narrower. Distinguish the cash that must be liquid from the cash that has simply defaulted to the bank out of habit. The first is a tool. The second is a slow bleed. In a low real yield world, money held far beyond an emergency buffer is not being protected. It is being spent, invisibly by inflation, on nothing. Which is the quiet truth this first habit hides in plain sight. A savings account paying below inflation is not caution. It is a leak the household has agreed to, without ever being asked. Consider a couple in Michigan, both in their early 40s in 2009, both with vivid memories of the two crashes that bracketed their adult financial lives. In 2000, they had a modest technology-heavy retirement balance they had been proud of. By 2002, it had lost roughly half its value. They held on, rebuilt slowly, told themselves they had learned patience. Then 2008 arrived, and the broad market fell by more than 50% from its peak. The account they had spent 6 years repairing was cut down again. This time they did not hold on. They did something that felt not just reasonable but wise. They moved what remained into cash and bonds, and resolved never again to hand their family's security to a market that had betrayed it twice in a single decade. They kept saving diligently. They simply stopped investing. Sit with the emotion of that decision, because it is the center of this habit. This was not panic. It was the opposite of panic. A sober, deliberate withdrawal made by people who had done everything right and been punished for it twice. They had contributed steadily. They had diversified, or believed they had. They had stayed the course through the first crash exactly as instructed, and the reward for that discipline was a second crash. At some point, loyalty to a system that keeps hurting you stops looking like courage and starts looking like foolishness. The scar tissue was earned. Anyone who lived through 2000 to 2009 and felt nothing was not paying attention. And that is precisely why the turn is so painful. The bottom of that second crash, March 2009, was not the beginning of another decline. It was the beginning of one of the longest and strongest bull markets in American history. From the 2009 low, the broad U.S. stock market rose roughly fivefold over the following decade. Dividends reinvested. The households burned worst by the two crashes, the ones whose caution had been most thoroughly justified by experience, were disproportionately the households sitting in cash for the entire recovery that would have healed them. Their scar tissue was real. It was also pointed in exactly the wrong direction at exactly the wrong moment. Run the arithmetic on that Michigan couple. Say they had $80,000 in 2009 and kept it in bonds and savings, earning very little in real terms. 10 years later, that money had roughly held its purchasing power, no disaster, but no growth. Had the same $80,000 stayed invested in a broad index through the recovery they were too scarred to trust, it would plausibly have grown to well over $300,000. The gap between those two numbers is not the price of a mistake. It is the price of a lesson, a genuine, hard-won lesson that happened to expire the moment it was learned. Here is the structural point the emotion obscures. Their instinct treated the stock market as a single object that could be trusted or distrusted as a whole. But equities are not a coin flip repeated each morning. Over the 1985 to 2005 economy, the house had done their compounding for them, so staying out of stocks cost little. Once home price-to-income ratios climbed and the house became a leveraged bet rather than a quiet engine, equities were no longer optional insurance. They became the primary compounding vehicle a middle-class household had left. Withdrawing from them was not neutral safety, it was removing the one asset still doing the work. The correction is not to forget the crashes. It is to separate the volatility they fear, which is real and recurring, from the loss they fear, which only becomes permanent when a scared household sells at the bottom and stays out. 3-to-1. That was the ratio in 1985, a median home priced at roughly 3 times a median household's annual income. By the mid-2000s, that number had drifted toward 5. By 2022, in a large share of American metros, it crossed 7, and in the most strained coastal markets it ran past 10. Same asset, same instinct to own it, a price tag that had quietly doubled and tripled relative to the wage meant to carry it. That single ratio hides something the household almost never sees, because the house does not present itself as a financial position at all. It presents itself as a place to live and a form of forced savings, the one virtue nobody argues with. And as forced savings, it worked beautifully in the old economy. At 3-to-1, a family put down a manageable sum, borrowed a manageable multiple of its income, and watched principal retire while the asset appreciated. The leverage was real but modest, and the modesty is the entire point. Borrowing 3 times your income against an asset is a different animal from borrowing 7 times your income against the same kind of asset. Here is what the price-to-income number quietly changes underneath the habit. When a household buys a home for 7 times its income with 10 or 20% down, it is not making a savings decision. It is taking a leveraged, concentrated position. One asset, in one neighborhood, in one metro, funded largely with borrowed money, representing not a slice of net worth but nearly the whole of it. That would be recognized instantly as reckless in any other context. A financial advisor who suggested putting 80% of a family's wealth into a single stock bought mostly on margin would lose their license. Wrap that identical structure in a front porch and it becomes the definition of responsibility. Recalculate what the leverage actually does at the new ratio. Leverage is symmetric. It multiplies gains and losses alike. At 3-to-1 with substantial equity, a 10% dip in home value dents the household. At 7-to-1 with 5% down, the same 10% dip can erase the entire down payment and then some, leaving the family owing more than the house is worth. The 2008 foreclosure wave was, mechanically, this arithmetic arriving all at once. The households wiped out were rarely the reckless ones. They were often the diligent buyers who had simply purchased at the wrong multiple, in the wrong year, doing the thing everyone told them was the safe adult wealth-building move. Run the two scenarios side by side. In 1985, the forced savings house was a low-leverage engine that compounded quietly and could absorb a shock. In the 2020s, the identical strategy, buy the median home, treat the mortgage as enforced discipline, installs the largest concentrated borrowed bet a family will ever make and calls it the opposite of a bet. The habit did not change, the multiple underneath it did, and the multiple is what determines whether a house is a foundation or a fault line. This is not an argument against owning a home. Shelter has value that no ratio captures, and a paid-off house in retirement is a genuine asset. The correction is narrower and harder. It is to stop confusing the emotional safety of ownership with the financial reality of the position. It is to ask what multiple of income the mortgage represents, how much of total net worth sits inside those 4 walls, and what a 15% price move would do to the family's actual equity. It is to treat the largest purchase of a lifetime as the portfolio decision it has quietly become, rather than the paperwork it pretends to be. Because the number the household never runs is the one that matters most. The mortgage they call safety is the single largest undiversified position most families will ever hold, and almost no one who signs it has been shown that sentence. There is a number most workers have never been shown, and it is the price of standing still. Employees who stay with the same company through their 30s and 40s earn raises when they get them that have hovered around 3% a year in the recent low inflation era. Workers who change employers instead have captured raises closer to 7, 8, sometimes double digits on the switch. That gap does not close. It compounds, and it runs directly against one of the most respected instincts the middle class was ever handed: Be loyal, and you will be taken care of. Take that instinct seriously first, because it was not sentiment, it was structure. In the pension and personnel economy of roughly 1965 to 1995, a large employer functioned as a wealth machine that rewarded exactly one behavior: staying. The defined benefit pension accrued with tenure, backloaded so that the final years counted for far more than the early ones. Health coverage, seniority, promotion from within, the pension multiplier. All of it paid the patient and quietly penalized the person who left. Under those rules, the job hopper was the imprudent one, forfeiting the very machinery designed to convert loyalty into a funded retirement. A worker who stayed 30 years and walked out with a guaranteed check for life was not naive. He was playing the game as it was actually built. Now watch the machinery get dismantled while the instinct survives. The pension froze first. Through the 1990s and 2000s, defined benefit plans were closed, converted, and terminated, replaced by the 401k, an account the worker funds himself, that travels with him, and that rewards tenure not at all. Once the retirement no longer accrued with loyalty, the single largest financial reason to stay simply evaporated. What remained was raises, and raises decoupled from prices. Since the 1970s, real wages for the typical worker have grown far more slowly than productivity, and the annual internal raise settled into a range that barely tracks inflation. Loyalty stopped buying a pension and started buying, at best, a cost of living adjustment that often was not one. Consider a composite case. An operations manager in Ohio, hired at $55,000 in 2013, stays put, reliable, well-reviewed, exactly the employee handbook's praise. 10 years of solid 3% raises carry him to roughly $74,000 by 2023. A peer with identical skills who changed employers twice over the same decade, capturing a step of 10 to 15% each move plus internal raises in between, plausibly clears $100,000. Same competence. Same decade. The only variable is that one treated his employer as a home and the other treated it as a market. The gap was not earned by talent, it was collected by movement. And it does not stay a salary gap. Every future raise, every match, every Social Security credit is calculated off the base, so the loyal manager's lower number keeps generating a smaller number for the rest of his working life. The penalty compounds silently, the same way the savings account leak did. No red statement, no memo, just a widening distance he never sees because he is looking at a paycheck that goes up every year. The correction is not restlessness for its own sake, and it is not disloyalty as a virtue. It is recognizing that the employer no longer runs a machine that rewards tenure, so the worker has to run that machine himself. That means benchmarking pay against the external market on a schedule, not an emotion. It means treating a competing offer as information rather than betrayal. It means understanding that in an economy where the raise for leaving routinely doubles the raise for staying, standing still is not the safe choice, it is the expensive one. Because the arithmetic has quietly inverted. Staying put once compounded trust into a funded retirement, now it compounds, year after invisible year, into a pay cut. A household that pays off a fixed-rate mortgage a decade early, cheering every extra principal payment, may be handing thousands of dollars to a lender it believes it is defeating. That is the uncomfortable shape of the fifth habit, total debt aversion, and it is the one most likely to be worn as a badge of honor. Steelman it first, because it earned its reputation. For the generation that raised most of today's middle class, debt genuinely was the enemy. In the credit environment before the 1980s, borrowing outside a mortgage was expensive, rationed, and often predatory. Revolving credit carried punishing rates. A family that owed money owed it at terms that compounded against them faster than almost anything they could earn. Under those conditions, the rule, avoid debt, pay cash, owe no one, was not superstition. It was survival arithmetic. The household that stayed debt-free kept the compounding on its own side of the ledger, and the debt-laden household watched interest quietly eat its future. Discipline here was not fear, it was correct. But a rule built to fight one kind of debt hardened into a blanket refusal of all of it, and that is where the mechanism turns. Consider two households, identical incomes, identical savings rate, both buying a home in 2013 with a 30-year mortgage near 4%. The first treats the mortgage as a moral wound and throws every spare dollar at it, retiring the loan in 14 years, proud and unburdened. The second keeps the mortgage on its original schedule, makes only the required payments, and routes the same spare dollars into a diversified index fund instead. By the early 2020s, the first household owns its home free and clear and holds little else. The second still owes on a house, at a fixed rate now far below prevailing borrowing costs, while sitting on an investment balance that, over that stretch, roughly doubled. The debt-averse family won the emotional battle and lost the arithmetic one. Its victory cost it the gap between 4% and the return it never captured. Now add the term the debt-averse household never puts on paper. Inflation does not touch a fixed obligation. The mortgage payment locked in for 2013 was still the same nominal number in 2023, but the dollars used to pay it had lost roughly a fifth of their purchasing power along the way. A fixed-rate debt in an inflationary decade is quietly repaid in cheaper and cheaper money. The borrower's burden shrinks in real terms every year, automatically, without a single extra payment. The household racing to extinguish that debt is voluntarily surrendering an advantage the structure was handing it for free. Sit with the strangeness of that. The prudent instinct, owe nothing, be free, was engineered for an economy of expensive, unstable short-term debt. Transplanted into an economy of long, fixed, low-rate obligations under persistent inflation, the same instinct throws away the one form of leverage that works in the borrower's favor. The habit did not change. The kind of debt available changed, and the inflation composition changed, and the two together flipped the sign on the rule. The correction is not to celebrate debt, it is to stop treating all debt as one substance. High-rate, variable consumption debt remains the old enemy and deserves the old ruthlessness. But a long fixed obligation at a rate below inflation is not a chain. It is a position, one that quietly transfers value from lender to borrower as prices rise and dollars shrink. The distinction between those two is the entire game, and the household that refuses to draw it forfeits the good with the bad. Because here is the quiet arithmetic underneath the fifth habit. Refusing all debt in an economy that inflates away fixed obligations is a gift to the lender you never meant to give, paid cheerfully in the name of freedom. A family can hold $200,000 in equity and still be the most fragile household on its street. That is the sentence that ties the last several habits together, and it explains why the biggest, safest-looking positions, the house, the loyal career, the cash pile, the aversion to debt, turned out to be exactly where the trap was set. Start with the tension the previous blocks built and never quite released. Each of the large habits felt safe for the same reason: it concentrated. The house concentrated a family's net worth into one address. The single employer concentrated its income into one payroll. The savings account concentrated its reserves into one currency, losing ground to prices. Debt aversion concentrated the household's whole financial personality around a single rule. In the old economy, concentration was not the danger, because an external structure was diversifying the risk on the household's behalf. A 3-to-1 house could absorb a shock. A pension spread a career's loyalty across a funded, guaranteed check. The saver's dollar earned a real return. The family concentrated and the structure quietly cushioned. Now the relief, because there is one, and it is the whole point of seeing the mechanism clearly. None of these positions is wrong in isolation. A house is shelter and, paid off, a genuine asset. A steady job is a real income. Cash is real liquidity. A low fixed mortgage is, as the last block showed, a gift. The problem was never any single piece. The problem was that all of them leaned the same direction at once, and the props that used to lean back were removed one by one, without announcement, across 2 decades. Here is the revelation the act has been circling. The biggest, safest asset became the biggest trap, not because it got riskier on its own, but because it stopped being offset. Watch the mechanism assemble. The house climbed from 3 times income to 7, turning modest leverage into a concentrated, borrowed bet. The pension that once diversified the loyal worker's future was frozen and handed back to him as a self-funded account. The cash that once paid a real yield began to bleed after 2009, and through all of it, the household kept doing what worked when each piece stood alone, never seeing that the pieces had become correlated. When the same shock could hit the home value, the local job market, and the family's borrowing power in the same year as it did in 2008, the household discovered it had not built a foundation. It had built one large, undiversified position wearing 4 different disguises. That is the answer to the question this act has held open. Safety was never a property of the asset. It was a property of the structure around it, and that structure quietly expired. The house did not betray anyone. The employer did not betray anyone. The dollar did not betray anyone. What failed was the assumption that a stable external machine would keep converting concentration into security the way it once reliably did. Remove the machine, and concentration is just concentration, a family standing on one leg and calling it balance. The households caught in this are not the careless ones. They are the ones who committed hardest to the largest, most respectable positions, who put the most into the house, stayed the longest at the job, kept the most in the bank, and drew the firmest line against debt. Their diligence loaded the trap. Their loyalty to the old structure is precisely what left them undiversified inside the new one. But notice something the big pieces cannot explain on their own. 2 families can hold the same overpriced house, the same loyal job, the same cautious cash, and one of them still pulls ahead. The large habits set the trap. They do not, by themselves, decide who escapes it. The smaller, quieter habits do. A 3-year-old car with 40,000 miles on it sells for roughly half of what it cost new. That is not a defect. That is the machine working exactly as designed. The person who bought it new absorbed that entire drop. Tens of thousands of dollars of value that evaporated in the time it took to pay off part of the loan. And the second owner, arriving at year 3, collects a vehicle that will run reliably for another decade at half the price. This is the 6th habit, and it is the one that hides inside a virtue almost no one questions. Buy it new, buy it once, buy the peace of mind. Steelman it, because it was once close to correct. In the economy of the 1980s and early 1990s, a used car was a genuine gamble. Build quality was inconsistent, engines commonly tired near 100,000 miles, and a family had no reliable way to see a vehicle's history. Paying the premium for new was not vanity. It was buying information and durability that the used market could not credibly supply. The depreciation gap was real, but so was the risk it insured against. And for a household that could not afford a surprise transmission, the premium was rational insurance. Now watch the arithmetic diverge from the instinct. 2 things changed, and both are dateable. First, durability improved. By the 2010s, the average vehicle on American roads had crossed 12 years old, and reaching 200,000 miles stopped being remarkable. The reliability the new car premium was insuring against had largely been engineered out. Second, information became cheap. History reports, standardized inspections, certified pre-owned programs. The gamble the premium once covered had been priced down to near nothing. The insurance stayed in the sticker. The risk it insured against did not. Consider a composite household in Georgia, careful with money, that buys a new $35,000 SUV every 7 years, financing each one. Over a 30-year span, that is roughly 4 vehicles, and the depreciation absorbed in the first 3 years of each, the steepest part of the curve, runs to the better part of $60,000 handed to the next owner across those decades. A neighbor with identical transportation needs, who buys 3-year-old versions of the same vehicles, letting someone else eat the initial drop, keeps most of that $60,000. Invested at even a modest return over 30 years, that recovered spread compounds into a 6-figure difference. Same driveway, same reliability. One household simply refused to pay the depreciation transfer. The pattern is not confined to cars. The instinct to buy reliability new extends to appliances, to furniture, to the replacement of things that still work because a newer version promises fewer worries. Each purchase feels like prudence, buying quality, avoiding breakdown, protecting the household from the hassle of the used and the uncertain. And in each case, the same quiet handoff occurs. The buyer pays full price for the first and most expensive years of an asset's life, then discards or trades it precisely when someone else could have carried it cheaply for years more. This is where a second household, changing nothing about its income, begins to separate from the first. The families in the earlier chapters were trapped by their largest positions: the house, the job, the cash. This is smaller and entirely within reach. No raise is required to stop absorbing depreciation. No promotion, no windfall, no market timing. Only a decision about who eats the first 3 years of an asset's decline. Which raises the question the rest of this story turns on. If a household cannot change its income this year, can it still change its direction? The large habits set the trap. The small ones decide who walks out of it. And every purchase made for peace of mind carries a hidden clause the buyer never reads aloud. The first 3 years of value belong to someone else. What is the largest bill an ordinary household pays over a lifetime? Larger than the house, larger than the cars, larger than every vacation combined? For most middle-class families, it is taxes. And it is the one enormous expense they treat not as a decision, but as a form to be filled out correctly in April, then forgotten until the following April. Consider 2 households in Illinois, both earning $90,000, both saving 10% of income, both diligent, both indistinguishable on paper. The first treats tax season as compliance. It files accurately, takes the standard deduction, contributes to a 401k up to the match because a coworker said to, and asks no further questions. Its benefits elections were made once, during a rushed onboarding week, and never revisited. The second household treats the same paperwork as a portfolio decision. It maxes pre-tax contributions to lower current taxable income, funds a health savings account as the quietly unmatched retirement vehicle it actually is, harvests losses in taxable accounts, and coordinates which dollars go into which type of bucket, taxable, tax-deferred, tax-free, on purpose. Run the 2 forward 20 years, identical income, identical savings rate. The difference is not effort, it is placement. The first household pays tax on money it did not need to expose, watches its taxable investments generate needless annual bills, and arrives at retirement with nearly everything in one tax-deferred account, meaning every dollar it withdraws will be taxed again as ordinary income. The second household spread its money across tax treatments the way an investor spreads across asset classes, and at retirement it can choose which bucket to draw from in which year, managing its own tax rate deliberately. On the same lifetime earnings, the gap between those 2 outcomes routinely runs into 6 figures. Same job, same discipline. One household simply read the instructions as choices rather than chores. Here is why this habit is so easy to acquire and so expensive to keep. Taxes and benefits present themselves as bureaucracy, dense, intimidating, governed by forms whose purpose seems to be to make you feel foolish for asking. The natural response of a busy, responsible person is to get it done, get it right, and get out. That instinct is not laziness, it is triage. But the paperwork framing hides the scale of what is being decided. The choice between a Roth and a traditional contribution is not administrative trivia. It is a bet on future tax rates worth tens of thousands of dollars. The decision to ignore an HSA is the decision to skip the single most tax-advantaged account in the code. These are among the highest leverage moves a household of ordinary income can make, and they are disguised as clerical work. The correction requires no raise and no risk. It is a reframing. Every tax election, every benefits enrollment, every choice of which account holds which dollar is a portfolio decision that happens to arrive wearing a form. The households that pull ahead without earning a cent more are frequently the ones that noticed this, that treated the tax code as terrain to be navigated rather than a bill to be paid. Most of these moves are available to anyone with a standard employer plan and an afternoon of attention. Which is the quiet truth this last habit hides. The line most households skim past, the withholding election, the account type box, the benefits menu click through in 90 seconds, is precisely the line where the wealthy do their most consequential math. 7 habits. 7 quiet leaks. But they were never leaking at the same rate, and the arithmetic gathered so far points, unmistakably, at one of them. It is not the savings account. That bleed is real, but it operates on the cash a household holds, and most households do not hold enough excess cash for the leak to dominate a lifetime. It is not the new car, or the tax election, or even the debt aversion, costly as those are. Those are meaningful sums measured in the tens of thousands. The most damaging habit is measured differently because it does not subtract a return. It removes the engine that was supposed to produce the return at all. The single most costly habit is the retreat from equities. Set it against its rivals directly, because the contrast is the proof. The overpriced house is dangerous, but the household still owns an appreciating asset and a place to live. The loyal career underpays, but it still pays. The debt-averse family surrenders leverage, yet keeps every dollar it earned. In each of those, the household ends up with less than it could have, but it still ends up with something compounding. The family that fled the stock market and stayed in cash ended up with the one thing none of the others produced, a balance that did not grow at all for a decade during the strongest recovery in living memory. Return to that couple in Michigan because they carry the whole case. $80,000 moved to safety in 2009, and roughly $80,000 in real terms a decade later. The same $80,000 left in a broad index would plausibly have crossed $300,000. That is not a shaved percentage point. That is $250,000 of compounding that simply never occurred on a single decision, made once and never revisited. Now deepen it, because the raw number understates the damage. Every other habit costs a household money it had. This habit costs a household money it would have had, and compounding does not forgive a missing decade. A dollar not invested at 40 is not merely a dollar short at retirement. It is that dollar and every doubling it would have gone through, gone. The equity retreat is the only habit on the list that steals from the future rather than the present, and the future is where all the growth lived. The savings account leak takes 2% a year of a modest cash pile. The equity retreat takes the entire slope of the curve. And it compounds a second time, structurally. Recall what changed underneath all 7 habits. The house stopped being the quiet engine. In the old economy, a family could sit out the stock market because the 3-to-1 home was doing the compounding on its own. Once housing climbed to 7-to-1 and became a leveraged, concentrated bet rather than a reliable engine, equities were no longer the optional garnish. They became the primary compounding vehicle a middle-class household had left. Withdrawing from them in the old economy cost little. Withdrawing from them in the new economy removes the last remaining machine that builds wealth without a bigger paycheck. That is why this habit sits at the center. It intersects every other failure. The cash that fled the market fed the savings account leak. The scar tissue was reinforced by the 2008 housing collapse, which was itself the overpriced house habit detonating. The households most burned, the diligent ones who stayed the course through the first crash and were punished with a second, are precisely the ones who then sat out the recovery. Their discipline earned them the wound, and the wound cost them the cure. Of the 7 respectable habits keeping middle-class households stuck, the one doing the most damage, quietly, invisibly, measured in 6 figures per household over a working life, is the retreat from equities, made rational by 2 crashes and rendered ruinous by the recovery that followed. The worst habit now has a name, which leaves only the harder question, whether a household, having seen all 7, can rewrite the entire playbook at once, or whether naming the leak is the easy part and closing it is the work of a lifetime. A household is not a boat that sank. It is a boat still seaworthy, sailing hard by a chart drawn for a coastline that has since eroded, silted, and shifted its channels. The crew is skilled. The discipline is real. Every maneuver is executed exactly as the chart instructs. And the boat keeps running aground on shoals that are not marked because the chart was accurate in 1995. That is the whole story of this documentary compressed into a single image, not a failure of seamanship, but a failure of the map to keep pace with the sea. If these households are doing everything responsibly, why does the gap keep widening? Because responsibility was never a fixed thing. It was a set of instructions that worked when an external structure, a 3-to-1 house, a 10-year rewarding pension, a dollar that paid real interest, quietly did the compounding on the household's behalf. Save in cash, and the bank made you richer. Buy the median home, and modest leverage built equity. Stay loyal, and the pension accrued. Avoid all debt, when debt was expensive and short. Buy new, when used was a genuine gamble. Sit out stocks, when the house was already the engine. Treat taxes as paperwork, when the brackets were simpler and the accounts fewer. Each rule was correct. Then, across 2 decades no one announced, the structures that made them correct were removed one by one, and the rules kept feeling exactly as responsible as they always had. The gap widens not despite the discipline, it widens through it. That is the verdict. It is not a comfortable one, but it is a kind one, because it moves the problem from character to chart. A character cannot be swapped out. A chart can. Here then is the corrected playbook, stated as plainly as the old one was. Separate the cash truly needed to reach from the cash merely defaulting to a bank that pays less than inflation. Treat the home as the largest concentrated position a household will ever hold, and ask what multiple of income it represents before calling it safety. Run your own pay machine, benchmarking against the market on a schedule, rather than waiting for loyalty to be rewarded. Distinguish the 2 kinds of debt, the expensive variable enemy from the long, fixed, inflation-eroded gift. Stop absorbing the first 3 years of every asset's depreciation. Read every tax and benefits election as the portfolio decision it actually is. And above all, because it was the costliest leak, the one that steals from the future rather than the present, do not confuse the volatility of equities, which is real and recurring, with permanent loss, which only arrives when a frightened household sells at the bottom and stays out. None of it requires a bigger paycheck. A household can change nothing about its income this year and still change its direction, because most of these corrections are decisions, not raises, reframings of money the family already has and moves already within reach. But naming the leaks is the easy part. Closing 7 of them at once is not a weekend project. It is the patient work of years, done against instincts that will keep feeling responsible while they cost you. The chart can be redrawn. Redrawing it is still on you. Everything here is structural, general, and historical. It is education, not personalized advice. The map, not the voyage. What a specific household should do with its specific numbers is a conversation this film cannot have. The old playbook was rational once. It simply outlived its economy. Wealth is built to last, but only by the households willing to notice when the ground beneath the rules has quietly moved.